Mahakassapa, the monk who preserved the discipline. There is a kind of silence that does not come from the absence of sound, but from the settling of the heart. It is the silence that arises when desire loosens its grip, when the mind stops leaning forward into what it wants, or recoiling from what it fears. In that silence, something ancient stirs, an awareness older than our personal stories, older than our ambitions and disappointments. This silence is not empty. It is full of gravity, full of responsibility, full of care. And it is within this silence that the life of Mahākassapa comes quietly into view. The world we inhabit today moves at a relentless speed. Ideas are consumed and discarded. Traditions are reshaped to fit convenience. Discipline is often misunderstood as repression, and restraint is mistaken for weakness. In such a world, the figure of a monk who chose simplicity over comfort, rigor over popularity, and fidelity over innovation may seem distant, even severe. Yet it is precisely because of this distance that his life mattered. Mahākassapa stands not as a relic of a vanished age, but as a mirror held up to every generation that inherits a spiritual path and must decide what to preserve and what to abandon. He was not known for eloquence. He did not seek followers. His presence did not dazzle. It grounded, like a mountain that does not move to prove its strength. Mahākassapa embodied a steadiness that asked nothing of the world and therefore could offer everything. Where others found inspiration in words, he found it in conduct. Where others expressed devotion through ritual, he expressed it through unwavering integrity. He understood, perhaps more clearly than most, that a teaching does not survive on ideas alone. It survives through lived discipline, through bodies that carry it forward with care, through lives shaped so completely by the path that the path itself becomes visible again. This is not a story about perfection. It is a story about responsibility, about what it means to hold something precious without claiming ownership over it, about what it means to stand firm when the world begins to loosen its grip on what once mattered. Mahākassapa did not preserve the discipline by clinging to rules as dead forms. He preserved it by embodying their spirit so thoroughly that others could not forget what the path looked like when it was walked with sincerity. As we listen, let us not rush to judge or imitate. Let us simply sit near this life, as one might sit near a quiet fire, and allow its warmth to reveal what has grown cold within us. Mahākassapa's journey did not begin in renunciation. Like many who would later abandon the world, he first lived deeply within it. Born into great wealth, he inherited not only material comfort, but the expectations that come with status. His life was arranged with precision. A suitable marriage, prosperity ensured, pleasures refined. Yet beneath this carefully constructed existence, a subtle unease took root. It was not dramatic despair, nor a sudden revelation. It was the quiet recognition that comfort does not cure restlessness, and abundance does not answer the deeper questions of the heart. His marriage, often misunderstood in later retellings, was itself marked by restraint. Both he and his wife sensed the fragility of worldly satisfaction. Even before formal renunciation, there was a turning away, a shared intuition that the life laid before them could not deliver what it promised. When the moment of departure came, it was not an escape from suffering, but a movement toward honesty. They parted not in bitterness, but in mutual respect for a truth. They both recognized that the path ahead required solitude and uncompromising clarity. When Mahākassapa encountered the Buddha's teaching, it was as if a long-held question finally met its answer. Yet his response was not excitement, it was resolve. Where others felt uplifted by the beauty of the message, he felt summoned by its demands. He did not seek a softened version of the path. He sought its edge. From the beginning, he gravitated toward austerity, not out of self-punishment, but out of understanding. He saw clearly that the mind, when coddled, becomes lazy, and when challenged, becomes awake. Mahākassapa chose the forest not as a romantic ideal, but as a practical environment for honesty. In the forest, there is no audience to impress, no reputation to manage. Hunger arrives when it arrives. Fear arises when it arises. Discomfort cannot be negotiated away. In such conditions, the mind reveals itself without disguise. For Mahākassapa, this was not a hardship but a gift. Each difficulty stripped away another layer of illusion, another excuse to remain unawakened. His commitment to ascetic practices was not a rejection of the middle way, as some later critics would suggest. Rather, it was his way of walking that middle way with exacting care. He understood that balance is not sameness, that different temperaments require different disciplines. What mattered was not the appearance of austerity, but its effect. And the effect in his case was unmistakable. A mind unburdened by excess, a heart free from entitlement, a presence that radiated quiet authority. As the community of monks grew, so too did diversity in practice. Some leaned toward scholarship, others toward teaching, others toward contemplation. Mahākassapa remained firmly rooted in conduct. He paid close attention to the rules, not as commandments imposed from above, but as supports for liberation. He saw how easily the mind justifies small compromises, how quickly convenience becomes habit and habit becomes norm. Discipline for him was not about control, it was about remembrance. Remembering why one had left the world in the first place. This is where his life begins to speak directly to ours. In every generation, there is a tension between adaptation and preservation. Teachings must meet people where they are, yet they risk being diluted in the process. Mahākassapa sensed this tension early. He did not oppose change blindly, nor did he cling to forms out of fear. What he opposed was forgetfulness, the slow erosion of intention, the subtle shift from liberation to comfort as the unspoken goal. He watched as some monks grew more relaxed, more willing to bend practices to suit circumstance. Perhaps they meant no harm. Perhaps they believed they were making the path more accessible. Mahākassapa did not argue. He did not condemn. He simply continued to live as he always had, letting his example stand as a question that did not need words. In his presence, excuses sounded hollow. In his silence, priorities became clear. The Buddha himself recognized this quality. Mahākassapa was not praised for brilliance or charisma, but for steadfastness. He was entrusted, not because he was agreeable, but because he was reliable. There is a profound lesson here. In a world that often rewards innovation over integrity, Mahākassapa reminds us that some things must be guarded with patience rather than reinvented with enthusiasm. The discipline was not an obstacle to awakening. It was its vessel. To preserve something living requires intimacy. Mahākassapa knew the discipline not as an external code, but as an internal compass. He felt when it was being honored and when it was being neglected. This sensitivity did not make him rigid. It made him attentive, like a gardener who knows the soil by touch. He sensed when the conditions for growth were being compromised. As the years passed, and the Buddha's physical presence drew closer to its end, an undercurrent of anxiety moved through the community. What would remain when the guiding voice fell silent? Who would hold the line when interpretations multiplied and memories diverged? Mahākassapa did not step forward to claim authority. Authority, in his understanding, was not seized. It was recognized. And it is here, on the threshold of great transition, that his role deepens. and the weight he carried becomes fully visible. For now, we pause here, at the edge of that moment, where discipline stands as both inheritance and responsibility, waiting to see who will have the courage to carry it forward without bending it to their own comfort. When the Buddha's life drew toward its final horizon, the air around the community subtly changed. Nothing dramatic announced itself. There was no sudden collapse, no visible fracture. Yet those who were attentive could feel it, the quiet trembling that comes when a great center of gravity begins to loosen. The teachings had been spoken, the path had been walked, the discipline had been laid down with care, and yet a question hovered unspoken in the minds of many. What happens when the one who embodies the path is no longer here to steady it? Mahākassapa felt this question deeply, not as fear, but as responsibility. He understood something essential about human nature, something that history has confirmed again and again. When the teacher is present, the teaching is clear. When the teacher is gone, interpretation begins. Memory softens, convenience creeps in. Not all at once, not with malice, but gradually like a river wearing away its own banks. Mahākassapa did not distrust his fellow monks. He distrusted complacency. He distrusted the mind's ability to convince itself that a small deviation does not matter. The Buddha's passing did not leave a vacuum of grief alone. It left a vacuum of authority, not authority in the worldly sense of command, but the quiet authority of example. For decades, the discipline had been anchored by a living presence. Now it had to be anchored by collective integrity. This is where Mahākassapa's strength became indispensable. He did not try to replace the Buddha. That would have been impossible and inappropriate. Instead, he took on a more difficult task: to protect the conditions that made awakening possible, even when enthusiasm waned and clarity blurred. Soon after the Buddha's passing, troubling news reached him. Some monks, relieved of the direct oversight of the teacher, had begun to relax certain practices. They argued that times had changed, that strict observance was no longer necessary, that the spirit mattered more than the letter. These arguments were not entirely wrong, which made them all the more dangerous. Mahākassapa understood that half-truths often cause more harm than outright falsehoods. The spirit and the form are not enemies, but neither are they interchangeable. Remove the form too quickly, and the spirit soon loses its footing. Mahākassapa's response was decisive, yet free of drama. He called for a gathering of elders, those whose practice was mature, whose memory was clear, whose commitment had been tested by time. This gathering was not convened to innovate or to debate philosophy. It was convened to remember, to recite together what had been heard, what had been practiced, what had been agreed upon when the Buddha was still present to correct misunderstandings before they hardened into doctrine. What makes this moment remarkable is not simply that such a council took place, but the spirit in which it was held. Mahākassapa did not approach the task as a judge or ruler. He approached it as a caretaker. His concern was not personal influence, but continuity. He knew that once uncertainty entered the discipline, it would not remain contained. It would spread quietly, disguised as compassion, flexibility, or progress. And so he acted early, not to freeze the teaching in time, but to give it a stable foundation from which it could continue to live. There is a subtle courage in this kind of action. It is far easier to allow small compromises than to risk being seen as inflexible. It is far easier to seek harmony through silence than to insist on careful reflection. Mahākassapa chose a different path. He chose fidelity over popularity, precision over ease. Not because he lacked warmth, but because he understood that true compassion sometimes appears severe. It refuses to trade long-term freedom for short-term comfort. During the recitations, every rule of conduct, every remembered teaching was examined with care, not rushed, not assumed. Voices spoke, others listened. Discrepancies were addressed, agreements were reaffirmed. This was not nostalgia, it was discernment. Mahākassapa knew that memory itself is impermanent, that even sincere practitioners remember differently. Only through collective effort could the teachings be held intact, like a fragile vessel passed carefully from hand to hand. Some may wonder why discipline mattered so much to him. Why not simply trust that awakening would arise naturally, regardless of external form? Mahākassapa's life offers a clear answer. He had seen how the mind operates under pressure and under ease. He had watched desire disguise itself as reason, laziness dress itself as wisdom. The discipline was not imposed to restrict freedom, but to protect it. It created a friction against habit, a structure within which insight could deepen rather than drift. His own life stood as proof. He continued to wear patched robes, to dwell in simple places, to accept hardship without complaint, not to make a point, but because he saw no reason to abandon what worked. He did not soften his practice with age. If anything, it became more refined, more transparent. In a community where reverence could easily turn into indulgence, his consistency was a quiet anchor. People knew where he stood, and because of that, they could orient themselves. There were those who found his presence uncomfortable. Discipline often unsettles those who wish to negotiate with the path. Mahākassapa did not respond to discomfort with defensiveness. He allowed it to do its work. He trusted that those who were sincere would eventually recognize the value of what he was protecting. He was willing to be misunderstood, a rare and demanding form of patience. In modern life, this aspect of his character can be difficult to appreciate. We live in a culture that prizes adaptability, that often equates discipline with rigidity. Yet if we look closely, we can see the cost of forgetting structure. Without clear boundaries, intention weakens. Without restraint, desire multiplies. Mahākassapa was not clinging to rules for their own sake. He was safeguarding the possibility of depth in a world that would always drift towards surface. What he preserved was not merely a set of regulations, but a way of being, a way of relating to one's own mind with honesty, a way of living that does not depend on constant stimulation or approval. He understood that once the discipline dissolved, the teaching would slowly transform into something else, perhaps comforting, perhaps inspiring, but no longer capable of cutting through delusion with the same clarity. As years passed, Mahākassapa's authority grew not because he asserted it, but because events confirmed his foresight. The discipline held, the teachings remained coherent, the path continued to be recognizable as a path of liberation rather than accommodation. This was not his personal achievement. It was the result of a life aligned so completely with responsibility that it could be trusted to act when others hesitated. And yet, even as he carried this weight, he did not become hardened. Those who encountered him closely spoke of his gentleness, his simplicity, his freedom from ambition. The discipline had not constricted his heart. It had cleared it. This is perhaps the most important lesson of all, that true discipline, when rightly held, does not make one narrow. It makes one spacious enough to hold the future without fear. In this way, Mahākassapa stood at a crucial turning point in the history of the path, not as a hero, not as a reformer, but as a guardian, one who understood that what is most precious is often most vulnerable, and that preserving it requires not force, but unwavering care. As time moved forward, Mahākassapa's presence became less a role and more a symbol, though he himself would never have used such a word. Symbols often invite projection, but Mahākassapa remained stubbornly real. He aged, his body weakened, His voice grew quieter, and yet the gravity he carried did not diminish. If anything, it deepened, as if the years had distilled his life down to its essential quality, trustworthiness. In a community shaped by impermanence, he became a reference point, not fixed, not frozen, but dependable in the way a true north remains dependable even as landscapes change. He never claimed ownership of the discipline he helped preserve. This is a subtle but crucial distinction. Ownership leads to defensiveness, to the need to protect one's position. Caretaking leads to humility, to the willingness to step aside when the work is done. Mahākassapa understood that the discipline did not belong to him, nor even to the community. It belonged to the path itself, to the possibility of awakening that future generations would either inherit or lose depending on how faithfully it was carried forward. In his later years, he increasingly withdrew from communal life, not out of disillusionment, but out of clarity. He had done what needed to be done. The teachings had been stabilized. The discipline had been reaffirmed. Now his task was simpler and more demanding at the same time. To live quietly, to embody without explanation, to let his life speak without interference. This withdrawal was not abandonment. It was trust. Trust that what had been planted would grow if given space. There is a tendency, especially in times of transition, to believe that vigilance must be constant, that without continuous control, things will fall apart. Mahakassapa did not fall into this trap. He knew that excessive guarding can be as harmful as neglect. Once the foundation was secure, clinging to authority would only distort the very discipline he sought to protect. And so he stepped back, leaving behind not instructions, but an example of how to relinquish responsibility without relinquishing care. His choice challenges a deep fear many of us carry, the fear that if we let go, what matters to us will disappear. Mahakassapa teaches a different lesson. He shows that when something has been tended with integrity, letting go becomes an act of faith rather than loss. The discipline did not survive because he held on to it forever. It survived because he knew when holding on was no longer necessary. In the quiet of his final years, Mahakassapa returned fully to the forest, to the rhythms that had shaped him from the beginning. His life came full circle, not as repetition, but as completion. There is something profoundly instructive in this arc. He did not build institutions. He did not establish a lineage centered on his name. He left no personal doctrine. What he left was subtler and more enduring, a standard of care, a reminder that liberation requires conditions, and that those conditions must be protected, not by force, but by lived example. For modern listeners, his life may feel distant, even austere. Few of us will wear patched robes or dwell in forests. Yet the essence of his teaching reaches far beyond monastic walls. We too inherit disciplines, ethical commitments, contemplative practices, values that orient us toward clarity rather than confusion. And we too face the temptation to soften them when they become inconvenient, to reinterpret them when they challenge our habits, to abandon them when they ask more than we wish to give. Mahakassapa invites us to ask a difficult question, one that does not accuse but illuminates. What are we entrusted with, and how are we caring for it? This question applies not only to spiritual traditions, but to relationships, to responsibilities, to inner commitments we once held sacred. Preservation, in this sense, is not about resisting change. It is about remembering why something mattered in the first place, and refusing to let that reason be eroded by forgetfulness. His life also reminds us that discipline and compassion are not opposites. True discipline arises from compassion, compassion for oneself, for others, for future generations who will need clear paths, rather than comforting illusions. When discipline loses this compassionate root, it becomes brittle. When compassion loses discipline, it becomes vague. Mahākassapa's greatness lay in holding these two together without confusion. Perhaps the most radical aspect of his legacy is its quietness. There is no dramatic final scene, no last proclamation. His influence continues not through spectacle, but through continuity. This is the kind of impact that resists measurement. It does not trend, it does not announce itself, and yet it shapes lives long after the individual has faded from view. In a world hungry for visibility, Mahākassapa stands as a reminder that what endures often does so invisibly. As we sit with his story, we may notice something subtle happening within us, a slowing down, a recalibration of what we consider important. This is not nostalgia for a simpler time, but recognition of a timeless truth, that freedom requires care, and care requires commitment. Not rigid commitment, but living commitment, responsive, honest, and willing to endure discomfort for the sake of clarity. Mahākassapa did not preserve the discipline by clinging to the past. He preserved it by inhabiting the present so fully that the essence of the path could pass through him unbroken. In doing so, he offered a gift not only to his contemporaries, but to all who would come after. Those who, like us, live in times of uncertainty and must decide what is worth holding steady. In the end, Mahākassapa's life asks very little of us, and everything at the same time. It does not demand imitation. It does not ask us to adopt his outer forms. It simply invites us to look honestly at how we hold what matter. Whether we are monks or householders, seekers or skeptics, we all stand in relation to disciplines that shape our freedom or our confusion. His legacy is not a call to severity, but to sincerity. To remember that the path is not preserved by words alone, nor by good intentions, but by lives aligned with care. In a world that constantly urges us to move on, to loosen commitments, to trade depth for ease, Mahākassapa offers a quiet counterpoint. Sometimes the most compassionate act is to remain faithful, even when no one is watching. If this reflection has stirred something in you, a sense of steadiness or a longing for clarity, allow it to settle. Let it accompany you beyond this moment, beyond this listen. And if you wish to continue walking alongside teachings that value depth over distraction, you are warmly invited to follow this channel, where we return again and again to the quiet work of remembering what liberates. May whatever discipline you carry be held with gentleness and resolve. May it serve not as a burden but as a bridge, leading, step by patient step, toward freedom.